My name is Helena, and I'm 27 years old. I work as a nurse at Memorial Hospital, dedicated to helping others heal. Last week, I buried the man who raised me, my grandfather Arthur. He was my rock after my father died. When I returned from the funeral, exhausted and heartbroken, I discovered my bedroom completely emptied. My mother had thrown away my belongings to give my room to my stepsister. What hurt most weren't the discarded possessions, but the betrayal by my own mother. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone who should protect you, let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe, as I share how my grandfather's final gift changed everything. Growing up, my life was shaped by two significant events: losing my father when I was 8, and having my grandfather step in to fill that void. Dad died in a construction accident, leaving Mum and me devastated, but in very different ways. While I was a child grappling with the incomprehensible loss of my father, my mother Susan retreated into herself, becoming emotionally distant. She worked multiple jobs to keep our finances afloat, often leaving early and returning late, too exhausted to engage with my childish needs for comfort and reassurance. This is where Grandpa Arthur became my salvation. He lived just a few blocks away in our small Midwestern town, and after Dad died, he started showing up every day. At first, it was just to make sure I had breakfast before school and got on the bus safely. Then it expanded to picking me up after school, helping with homework, and making dinner most evenings before Mum returned from her second job. A child needs stability and love to grow strong, he would tell me as we planted tomatoes in his backyard garden each spring. Just like these seedlings need consistent care to thrive. Grandpa had been a high school science teacher before retiring, and he approached everything as a learning opportunity. He taught me to change the oil in a car, how to calculate a tip properly, and why the stars seem to move across the night sky. But most importantly, he taught me that my worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to love me properly. "Your mother loves you, Helena," he would say when I cried about her emotional absence. "She's just lost in her own grief. Some people don't know how to find their way back." I believed him because Grandpa never lied, but as years passed, Mum remained a shadow in our home, rather than a nurturing presence. She provided materially, but seemed incapable of providing emotionally. Meanwhile, Grandpa attended every school play, science fair, and parent-teacher conference. He cheered at my high school graduation and helped me research nursing schools proud when I announced my plan to work in healthcare. My choice wasn't random. During my teen years, Grandpa developed heart problems. Watching the nurses care for him during hospital stays sparked something in me. I wanted to provide that same compassion to others during their most vulnerable moments. Grandpa understood this calling before I could articulate it myself. "You have healing hands, Helena," he told me after I helped change his bandages following a minor procedure. And more importantly, a healing heart. Life continued in this pattern through my college years and into early adulthood. I got my nursing degree, started working at Memorial Hospital, and continued living in my childhood home to save money while paying off student loans. Mum had finally reached a management position at the retail company where she'd worked for years, bringing financial stability but not emotional connection. Everything changed 18 months ago when Mum announced she was getting remarried. Richard entered our lives like a hurricane, bringing wealth, confidence, and his 16-year-old daughter Amber with him. He was a businessman who owned several car dealerships in neighbouring counties, and from the beginning it was clear he viewed the world through a materialistic lens. "You still live with your mother?" he asked during our first meeting, his eyebrows raising in what felt like judgment. "At your age..." Mum quickly jumped to explain how I was saving for my own place and helping with bills, suddenly embarrassed by an arrangement that had worked for us for years. I noticed the shift immediately. Around Richard, my mother became a different person. She laughed too loudly at his mediocre jokes, agreed with his opinions without consideration, and began spending money on expensive clothes and salon visits she'd previously considered frivolous. 6 months ago, they married in a lavish ceremony that Grandpa deemed unnecessarily ostentatious in private conversations with me. A week later, Richard and Amber moved into our home, claiming they were having their much larger house renovated. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement showed no signs of ending as months passed. The dynamics in my childhood home shifted dramatically. Suddenly, there were comments about my hours as a nurse being disruptive when I returned from night shifts. My food in the refrigerator would disappear without apology. Family dinner conversations revolved around Richard's business achievements or Amber's social media following. Amber, with her carefully highlighted blonde hair and constantly pouting expression, made it clear from day one that she considered sharing a house with a regular working person beneath her status. She complained endlessly about her bedroom, which, while smaller than mine, was perfectly adequate for a teenager. "Daddy, this room is literally suffocating me," she whined one evening. "The view is just of the neighbor's siding. How am I supposed to make content in this lighting? Helena has the good room, and she's barely even here with her hospital schedule." I noticed Richard eyeing my room thoughtfully after that conversation, but I was too focused on Grandpa's declining health to pay much attention. His heart condition had worsened significantly over recent months, and I spent most of my free time at his house, helping with medications, taking him to doctor appointments, and simply being present as his energy diminished. During one of our final conversations, as he rested in his favorite armchair, he held my hand with surprising strength. "I worry about you, sweetheart," he said, his blue eyes cloudy but focused intently on my face. "Your mother hasn't been the same since Richard came into the picture." "I'm fine, Grandpa," I assured him. "I'm nearly done paying off my student loans. I'll be looking for my own place soon." He shook his head slowly. "Family should be a sanctuary, not a battleground. Promise me you'll remember your own worth when others forget it." I promised, not realizing how prophetic his words would become. 2 days later, Grandpa was hospitalized with congestive heart failure. The doctors were kind but honest. His heart was giving out. As a nurse, I understood the medical reality, but emotionally, I couldn't process a world without Arthur Sullivan in it. For a week, I barely left the hospital, taking time off work to sit beside his bed. Mum visited briefly twice, both times seeming distracted and uncomfortable in the sterile hospital environment. When Grandpa passed, I was holding his hand, telling him about a patient who had reminded me of his stubborn optimism. There was no dramatic final moment, just a gentle release as the monitor flatlined and the hand in mine gradually cooled. I like to think he heard me until the very end, that he left this world wrapped in the stories of how his legacy of kindness continued through me. It's the kind of comfort you create for yourself when grief threatens to swallow you whole. Planning Grandpa's funeral consumed my every waking moment in the days following his death. I threw myself into the details, selecting readings that reflected his love of science and nature, choosing music he had enjoyed, finding photos that captured his gentle spirit for the memorial display. While funeral directors typically handle many of these tasks, I needed the distraction needed to feel like I was still doing something for the man who had done everything for me. Mum seemed oddly detached from the process. When I asked for her input on the obituary wording, she glanced at her phone and said, "Whatever you think is best, Helena, you knew what he liked." The distance in her voice stung, but I was too emotionally exhausted to confront it. Throughout my life, I'd made excuses for my mother's emotional unavailability. After all, she'd lost her husband young, worked hard to provide for me, and according to Grandpa, some people simply didn't have the emotional tools to show love in conventional ways. But as I planned her father's funeral largely alone, the justifications felt increasingly hollow. The morning of the funeral dawned cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that Grandpa would have appreciated for its scientific clarity. The way frost crystals caught the sunlight, the perfect visibility of distant hills, the mathematical precision of geese flying south in formation. I arrived at the funeral home early to make sure everything was arranged according to plan. People began arriving an hour before the service. Former students whose lives had been touched by Arthur Sullivan's teaching neighbours, who had benefited from his generous spirit, fellow members of the Community Garden Club, where he'd volunteered well into his 70s. Each person who approached me had a story about my grandfather's impact on their lives. "He tutored my son for free when he was struggling with chemistry," one woman told me, clutching my hands. "Jacob's a chemical engineer now. Arthur showed up with his toolbox the day after my husband died," an elderly neighbour recalled. "Fixed every little thing in my house, so I wouldn't have to worry about it while grieving." These stories were both comforting and heartbreaking concrete evidence of the goodness that had departed from the world. Meanwhile, Mum arrived barely 15 minutes before the service, Richard and Amber in tow. Amber was dressed inappropriately in a short black dress that looked more suitable for a club than a funeral, and spent the time before the service taking discreet selfies with carefully practiced sad expressions. Richard shook hands with people as though he were at a business function, rather than a funeral, making networking connections even in this solemn setting. Mum seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly and stepping outside twice to take calls. During the service itself, I delivered a eulogy that chronicled not just Grandpa's accomplishments, but the small daily kindnesses that defined him. The way he always carried dog treats in his pockets for neighbourhood pets, how he remembered the names of every cashier at the grocery store, his habit of leaving anonymous gifts for struggling families during holidays. As I spoke, I noticed Mum checking her watch, whispering something to Richard, who nodded with unusual enthusiasm. After the graveside service, there was a reception at Grandpa's church. I stood for hours thanking people for coming, accepting condolences, and collecting more stories about Grandpa's impact. Mum, Richard, and Amber stayed less than 30 minutes before Mum approached me. "Helena, I've got a terrible headache," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We're going to head home. Will you be all right here?" I nodded mechanically, too drained to question her early departure. Several of Grandpa's friends had offered to help clean up after the reception, so I wasn't concerned about managing alone. What struck me as odd was that Mum didn't offer to wait for me or check if I needed a ride home later. By the time the last guest departed and we had packed up the remaining food and memorial displays, it was nearly 7 in the evening. Mrs. Abernathy, Grandpa's next-door neighbour of 30 years, insisted on driving me home, despite my protest that I could call a rideshare. "Arthur would never forgive me if I let his granddaughter take a taxi after burying him," she said firmly, her arthritic hands gripping her car keys with determination. "Besides, I want to hear how you're really doing away from all those people." The drive home was therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Abernathy didn't offer platitudes about time healing all wounds, or Grandpa being in a better place. Instead, she asked for specific memories, laughed at stories of Grandpa's stubborn nature, and shared her own grief openly. "It's not fair that the good ones leave us," she said as we pulled into my driveway. But Arthur packed more genuine living into his years than most people do in twice the time. I thanked her with a genuine hug, the first real moment of connection I'd felt all day. As her car pulled away, I noticed unusual activity in our normally quiet house. Lights on in every room, shadows moving quickly past windows, and what sounded like furniture being rearranged. Walking through the front door, I was immediately struck by a sense that something was wrong. Mum, Richard, and Amber were in the living room, all three freezing like guilty children when they saw me. Mum recovered first, smoothing her hair and approaching me with an artificial smile. "Helena, you're home. How was the rest of the reception?" Before I could answer, I noticed large plastic storage tubs stacked near the staircase, and what appeared to be new decorative items still in shopping bags scattered around the room. "What's going on?" I asked, my grief-fogged brain struggling to make sense of the scene. "We should discuss this tomorrow," Richard interjected. "You've had a long day." Something in his tone, a mixture of false sympathy and poorly concealed satisfaction, propelled me toward the stairs. I took them 2 at a time, awareness dawning that whatever they had been doing while I buried my grandfather, it wasn't going to be something I approved of. The door to my bedroom was open, and when I reached the threshold, I stopped breathing for a moment. The room was entirely transformed. My furniture was gone, my closet emptied, my walls stripped of the photos and artwork that had defined my space. In their place were Amber's possessions, her designer bedspread already arranged on a new bed frame, her makeup collection spread across what had been my desk, her clothing hanging in my closet. "What happened to my things?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer, as Amber appeared behind me, unable to contain her smile. "Mom said I could move in here since it's bigger and has the better view," she said with false sweetness. "Don't worry, we saved some of your important stuff." I turned and rushed downstairs, past my mother and Richard, out the front door to the curb where garbage collection had occurred that morning. 3 large black trash bags remained overlooked by the collectors, or deemed too numerous to take at once. With shaking hands, I tore one open to find my clothes haphazardly stuffed inside many items stained from contact with what looked like discarded food. The second bag contained books and papers, including journals I'd kept since childhood, and nursing textbooks that had cost hundreds of dollars. The third bag held framed photos, now with shattered glass, including irreplaceable pictures of my father and me, and the special collection of photos Grandpa had organized of our time together throughout my childhood. Rain had begun to fall, soaking through the thin plastic bags, water damage already destroying items that had survived the initial purge. I fell to my knees beside the remnants of my life, rain mingling with tears as I realized what had happened. While I was burying the man who had been my true parent, my mother had been erasing my existence from her home. A hand touched my shoulder, and I looked up to see Mom standing over me, an umbrella protecting only herself from the increasing downpour. "Helena, don't make a scene in front of the neighbours," she said quietly. "We saved your really important documents in a box in the garage. Everything else was just taking up space, and you're almost 30. It's time you found your own place anyway. Through the open door, I could see Richard watching from the living room, arms crossed in satisfaction. Behind him, Amber was taking selfies on the staircase, already treating the house as if I'd never existed within its walls. In that moment, soaking wet on the curb, surrounded by the discarded artifacts of my life, I understood that my mother had made her choice long ago. I just hadn't wanted to see it. The family I thought I had was an illusion I'd maintained through willful blindness and the buffer of Grandpa's unwavering love. Now, on the very day I had laid him to rest, that final protection was gone, and the truth of my place in my mother's life was clear as the rain washing away the ink in my childhood journals. I was disposable, less important than impressing her new husband and his spoiled daughter. 27 years of being her daughter counted for nothing against 6 months of being Richard's wife. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of grief, shock, and disorientation. My friend Gillian, a fellow nurse from the pediatric ward, took me in without hesitation when I showed up at her apartment that night with nothing but a garbage bag of salvaged possessions and incoherent explanations between sobs. "Stay as long as you need," she insisted, clearing out her small home office to make space for an air mattress. No one should be alone after losing their grandfather, let alone dealing with whatever that was. I tried returning to work after 3 days, desperate for the normalcy of routine and the distraction of focusing on others' needs instead of my own devastation. But I wasn't functioning effectively. I mixed up patient charts, forgot critical monitoring checks, and burst into tears in the supply closet when I couldn't find the right gauge of bandage. My supervisor, noticing my distress, gently suggested I take more bereavement leave. "Grief affects our cognitive function, Helena," she reminded me, speaking both as a medical professional and someone who cared. "You wouldn't expect a patient with a concussion to solve complex math problems. Don't expect yourself to manage critical care while your brain is processing multiple traumas." So I found myself with empty days stretching before me, haunting Gillian's apartment while she worked shifts alternating between crying jags and periods of numb dissociation. I hadn't spoken to my mother since that night, though she'd left several voicemail messages that gradually evolved from defensive justification to irritated demands that I stop overreacting and come collect the remaining box of my things from the garage. On the 10th day after the funeral, as I sat mindlessly scrolling through photos of Grandpa on my phone, an unfamiliar number called. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Is this Helena Sullivan?" a professional male voice inquired. "Yes, this is she," I responded automatically, expecting a telemarketer or perhaps a bill collector for one of the services I'd neglected during this period of upheaval. "This is Thomas Wortham from Wortham and Associates Law Firm. I was your grandfather's attorney. We've been trying to reach you at your home address without success. I wonder if you might be available to come to our office tomorrow regarding your grandfather's estate matters." The mention of Grandpa snapped me to attention. Of course, I agreed, writing down the address and appointment time he provided. I didn't expect much from the meeting. Grandpa had lived modestly on his teacher's pension. I assumed there might be some small bequest, perhaps his collection of first edition science books he knew I treasured, or instructions about donating his gardening equipment to the community garden where he'd volunteered. At most, I thought he might have left me his small savings to help with a down payment on my own place someday, something we'd discussed in recent years. When I arrived at the law office the next morning, having made an effort to look presentable for the first time in days, Mr. Wortham greeted me with unexpected warmth. He was older than I'd pictured from his voice, perhaps in his 70s himself, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Arthur spoke of you often," he said, as he led me into a comfortable conference room rather than the impersonal desk I'd expected. He was extraordinarily proud of the woman you've become. Those simple words nearly undid my composure before we'd even begun. I blinked rapidly, determined not to break down in the stranger's office, and took the offered seat at the polished table. "I'll be direct, Ms. Sullivan, as I believe that's what your grandfather would prefer." Mr. Wortham began opening a leather portfolio. Arthur made significant updates to his will approximately 4 months ago. While he had always intended to leave you his entire estate, he made additional arrangements after certain observations concerned him. I frowned slightly, wondering what Grandpa had observed that prompted legal actions. "To put it plainly, your grandfather has left you everything," Mr. Wortham continued. "His savings, which are more substantial than many realized, totaling approximately $287,000. His investment portfolio valued at roughly $350,000, his personal possessions, of course, and most significantly, the deed to the family home where your mother currently resides." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. The family home. You mean our house, my mother's house? Mr. Wortham shook his head gently. The property at 1487 Oak Ridge Drive has always been in your grandfather's name, Ms. Sullivan. After your father's passing, when your mother struggled financially, Arthur purchased the home to provide stability for you both. He allowed your mother to live there under an informal family arrangement, paying only the property taxes and insurance, rather than market-rate rent. The deed has always remained in his name, and now, according to his explicit instructions, transfers directly to you. My mind reeled with this revelation. All these years I'd believed we lived in my mother's house. Finding out Grandpa had been the actual owner, quietly ensuring we had a secure home, while letting Mom maintain the dignity of feeling independent, was exactly the kind of selfless action that defined his character. There's a letter he asked me to give you, Mr. Wortham added, sliding an envelope across the table. He suggested you read it privately, but I'm available to answer any questions about the legal aspects of your inheritance afterward. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope to find Grandpa's familiar handwriting, the slight shakiness of recent years evident in the curved letters. My dearest Helena, the letter began. If you're reading this, I've left you to navigate this world without my guidance, though never without my love. You have been the greatest joy of my life, the daughter of my heart, if not my body. I've tried to prepare you for everything I could foresee, but there are some storms that arrive without warning. I've observed changes in your mother since Richard entered the picture that trouble me deeply. Susan has always struggled with emotional connection, but her recent behavior suggests a fundamental shift in values and priorities that may leave you vulnerable. The home you grew up in was meant to be your sanctuary, your safe harbor. I fear that without legal protection, that sanctuary may be at risk. By leaving you the house and financial resources, I hope to ensure you always have options. This isn't meant to punish Susan, but to protect you. Use this inheritance wisely with the compassion and discernment you've always shown. Whether you choose to maintain the family home or create a new beginning elsewhere, know that my intention is for you to have the security and independence to make choices based on love rather than necessity. Remember what I've always told you, family should be a sanctuary, not a battleground. You deserve a home filled with respect and genuine care. Never settle for less than that. All my love follows you always. Grandpa. Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading the paper, trembling in my hands. Even from beyond death, Grandpa was protecting me, his foresight extending to exactly the scenario that had unfolded. He had seen the changes in my mother that I had willfully ignored, had recognized the threat to my security that Richard and his influence represented. Mr. Wortham waited patiently while I composed myself, discreetly sliding a box of tissues within reach. When I finally looked up, he continued with the practical matters. The transfer of property is already legally complete, he explained. As the rightful owner, you have several options regarding the current occupants. They can remain as tenants with a formal lease agreement. They can purchase the property from you at fair market value, or you can request they vacate the premises. Given the family dynamics, I would be happy to act as intermediary in whatever course you choose. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I felt a sense of possibility rather than just loss. The inheritance wasn't just about property or money. It was about agency, about having the power to determine my own circumstances, rather than being at the mercy of others' decisions. Grandpa had given me not just resources, but the freedom to establish boundaries and create the kind of home environment he believed I deserved. I'll need some time to consider my options, I told Mr. Wortham, gathering Grandpa's letter and the folder of legal documents he provided, detailing the extent of my inheritance. Of course, he nodded. Arthur anticipated you might need processing time. He always spoke of your thoughtful nature. Take whatever time you need, but do be aware that the longer the current situation continues informally, the more complicated it may become legally. As I left the law office, stepping into sunshine that somehow seemed brighter than it had an hour before, I realized I wasn't powerless in the face of my mother's betrayal. I had choices to make. Difficult ones certainly, but choices nonetheless. And for the first time since watching the garbage truck take away pieces of my history, I felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. With the knowledge of my inheritance came the weight of decision-making. I couldn't continue sleeping on Gillian's air mattress indefinitely, but I also couldn't rush into confronting my mother without careful consideration. This wasn't just about reclaiming space or possessions. It was about establishing boundaries that should have existed long ago. My first step was consulting with another attorney, one specializing in property law rather than estate matters. The attorney, a straightforward woman named Margaret Chen, reviewed my documentation and explained my rights and responsibilities as the new homeowner. Legally, they're essentially unlicensed occupants at this point, she explained. Since there was never a formal rental agreement with your grandfather and the property has transferred to you, you have significant authority here. However, there are still proper procedures to follow for legal protection. She outlined my options in practical terms. I could establish a formal landlord-tenant relationship with a market-rate lease agreement, sell them the property if they could afford to purchase it, or provide written notice to vacate with the legally required timeline. Given the circumstances, she suggested 30 days would be appropriate and defensible in court if challenged. Document everything, she advised. Every communication, every interaction. Given the emotional nature of family disputes, having clear records is essential. With legal clarity established, I turned to the emotional preparation necessary for whatever path I chose. My friend Natalie, a social worker, recommended a therapist specializing in family trauma. During our first session, Dr. Powell helped me articulate feelings I'd been struggling to name. What you're describing is a profound betrayal of trust, she observed after I recounted the events surrounding the funeral. Your mother violated not just your physical space, but the implicit understanding that parents protect rather than harm their children. Over several intensive sessions, we explored my lifelong pattern of making excuses for my mother's emotional neglect and the reality that Grandpa had been my true parental figure all along. Dr. Powell helped me draft boundaries and practice assertive communication for the inevitable confrontation. Your grandfather's final gift wasn't just financial security, she noted. It was permission to prioritize your own well-being, something you've rarely done. While processing these emotional elements, I was also taking practical steps. I made an inventory of what possessions had been salvaged and what had been permanently lost. Irreplaceable items like childhood photos and mementos from my father were gone forever, a grief I had to acknowledge separately from the loss of Grandpa himself. I spoke with a real estate agent to understand the current market value of the house, learning it was worth significantly more than I'd realized in our increasingly desirable neighborhood. I researched apartment options in case I decided to sell rather than live there myself. I gathered estimates for changing lock security system installation and repairs that would be needed regardless of my ultimate decision. Through all this preparation, I avoided direct contact with my mother, though she continued leaving increasingly frustrated voicemails. Helena, this silent treatment is childish, her most recent message declared. It was just stuff, most of it you hadn't used in years. We saved the important documents. You're too old to be living at home anyway. Call me back so we can move past this ridiculous situation. Her messages reinforced that she didn't view her actions as a betrayal warranting apology, but rather as a reasonable decision I was overreacting to. This confirmation of her perspective strengthened my resolve about the boundaries needed going forward. I also reached out to my father's sister, Aunt Diane, who had drifted from our lives after tensions with my mother following Dad's death. Our reconnection was cathartic, filling in gaps in my understanding of family history and providing another perspective on my mother's long-standing patterns. Susan was always concerned with appearances, Aunt Diane reflected during our lunch meeting. After David died, we tried to help, but she seemed to resent any support that highlighted she couldn't manage alone. Your grandfather was the only one she would accept help from, and I suspect that was only because she could pretend it was for your benefit rather than hers. This insight into my mother's pride and her need to maintain certain illusions helped me understand her susceptibility to Richard's influence. The wealth and status he represented aligned perfectly with her priority on appearances and social standing. After 2 weeks of preparation, consultation, and soul-searching, I had reached my decision. I would not sell the house immediately, nor would I attempt to continue living under the same roof as my mother and Richard. Instead, I would assert my ownership rights, require them to either establish a formal rental agreement at market rate or vacate the property, and then determine my long-term plans based on their response. I arranged for 2 friends to accompany me to the house on a Saturday morning when I knew all 3 occupants would be home. Gillian and Natalie provided both emotional support and served as witnesses to whatever unfolded. I brought copies of all legal documentation, a formal written notice outlining the 3 options available to my mother and Richard, and a small suitcase containing essentials I would need if I decided to stay in the house immediately. The night before this confrontation, I sat in Gillian's apartment looking at the few salvaged photos of Grandpa I had managed to rescue from the rain-soaked garbage bags. I'm trying to do this right, I told his smiling image. With firmness, but without cruelty. I hope you'd be proud of how I'm handling this. Chrissy! In my heart, I felt his reassurance. Arthur Sullivan had never been vengeful or petty, but he had been a man of principle who believed in natural consequences for actions. By designating me as his heir, he had trusted my judgment about how to proceed. I intended to honour that trust by acting with integrity, even in the face of those who had shown me none. As I fell asleep that night, I felt a surprising sense of calm. Tomorrow would be difficult, potentially explosive, but necessary. For the first time in my life, I would stand firmly in my own worth, establishing boundaries that reflected the self-respect Grandpa had always tried to nurture in me. Whatever happened, I would face it, knowing I was no longer the helpless person sobbing over garbage bags in the rain. I was the woman Arthur Sullivan had raised me to be compassionate, but not a doormat understanding, but not an enabler. The house that had witnessed my childhood would now witness my complete step into adulthood, not through age, but through the willingness to advocate for myself with the same fierce protection I would offer any patient in my care. Tomorrow, I would reclaim not just physical space, but my place in the world as someone worthy of basic respect and consideration. The morning of the confrontation arrived with unusual clarity. I woke before my alarm, mentally rehearsing what I would say and preparing for various reactions. My friends arrived promptly at 9, both offering reassuring hugs before we drove to the house that was now legally mine. "We've got your back," Natalie assured me. "Just stick to your plan and remember to breathe." As we pulled into the driveway, I noted Richard's luxury SUV and my mother's sedan parked side by side. The house looked exactly as it had 2 weeks ago, yet everything about it felt different now that I understood its true ownership history. I used my key to enter, without knocking, a small assertion of my rights as property owner. The sound of the door opening brought my mother from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation when she saw me. "Finally decided to stop sulking?" she asked, then noticed Gillian and Natalie behind me. "I don't see why you needed to bring an audience." "They're here as witnesses," I replied calmly. "Is Richard home and Amber? I need to speak with all of you." My mother's eyebrows raised at my tone, so different from my usual accommodating manner. "Richard!" she called toward the stairs. "Helena's here with some friends." Richard appeared moments later, still in a bathrobe despite the late morning hour. Amber trailed behind him, not bothering to look up from her phone as she entered the living room. "Well, look who's decided to grace us with her presence," Richard said, with false joviality. "Come to collect your things from the garage. Susan's been telling you to do that for days." "Actually, I'm here to discuss the ownership of this house," I replied, gesturing toward the sofa. "Please, let's all sit down. This is an important conversation." Something in my demeanor must have registered as different because they complied without further comment. I remained standing deliberately, choosing the position of authority as I removed the legal documents from my bag. 2 weeks ago, I buried my grandfather. I began, my voice steady, despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. The same day, I returned to find you had thrown away my belongings and given my room to Amber without warning or consent. "We've been through this, Helena," my mother interrupted. "You're too old to be living at home, and Amber needed the space. We saved your important documents." I held up my hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically assertive that it actually silenced her. "I'm not finished. What none of us knew that day was that Grandpa had updated his will 4 months ago. He left his entire estate to me, including this house." The room fell completely silent. Richard straightened, his expression sharpening with sudden interest. My mother's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. Even Amber looked up from her phone. "That's not possible," my mother finally said. "This is my house. I've lived here for 20 years. "Actually, it's been your father's house the entire time," I corrected, passing her the property deed with the transfer documentation. "Grandpa bought it after Dad died to make sure we had stability, but he kept the deed in his name. He allowed you to live here, paying only taxes and insurance rather than rent or mortgage." Richard snatched the papers from my mother's hands, scanning them with increasing alarm. "This can't be legally binding. Arthur wasn't in his right mind in those final months." "Mr. Wertham, his attorney of 30 years, would disagree," I replied, as would the notary and witnesses who verified his competence when he updated his will. "The transfer is complete and legally binding. I am now the owner of this property." My mother's face had drained of colour as the implications sank in. Why would Dad do this? Why wouldn't he leave the house to me? I was his daughter. The hurt in her voice might have swayed me weeks earlier, but I now recognized it as the same self-centered perspective that had allowed her to discard my belongings without remorse. "He did it to protect me," I answered simply. "He saw how things were changing in this household and wanted to ensure I wouldn't be left without options." Richard's expression had transformed from dismissive to calculating. "So what happens now? Are you evicting your own mother? That would make for interesting gossip around town." His attempt at manipulation was transparent. I had anticipated this tactic during my preparations with Dr. Powell and was ready with a measured response. "I'm presenting 3 options," I replied, handing copies of the formal letter to both Richard and my mother. "First, you can remain here as tenants with a formal lease agreement at market rate, which would be $2,400 monthly plus utilities. Second, you can purchase the property from me at its appraised value of $475,000. Or third, you can vacate the premises within 30 days. My mother began reading the document with trembling hands, while Richard immediately pulled out his phone, presumably to contact his own lawyer. Amber looked between the adults with growing awareness that something significant was happening. "You can't be serious," my mother finally said. "We're family. You can't charge your own mother rent." "Family respects each other's boundaries and possessions," I replied quietly. "Family doesn't throw away cherished mementos and childhood keepsakes without permission. Family doesn't treat one member as disposable when a more convenient arrangement presents itself." "This is ridiculous," Richard interjected. "Susan has lived here for decades. She has rights as a long-term resident." "Actually, she has resided here at the pleasure of the property owner, which was Grandpa, and is now me," I corrected him. "There's never been a formal rental agreement establishing tenancy rights. My attorney has confirmed that a 30-day notice is both legal and generous under these circumstances." Richard's face flushed with anger. "I'm calling my lawyer right now," he declared, stepping into the kitchen with his phone. My mother stared at me as though seeing a stranger. In many ways she was. The obedient daughter who had accepted emotional neglect with understanding and made excuses for her mother's limitations had been replaced by a woman standing firmly in her own worth. "I never thought you could be so cold," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "After everything I've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me, Mom?" I asked the question genuine rather than accusatory. "When have you ever prioritized my well-being over your comfort or convenience? When have you protected me the way a parent should? It was Grandpa who raised me, Grandpa who attended school events, Grandpa who taught me to value myself even when you couldn't see my worth." The tears in her eyes spilled over, whether from genuine remorse or the realization that her actions had finally generated consequences I couldn't determine. Before she could respond, Richard returned, his demeanor noticeably shifted. "My lawyer confirms the property transfer appears legitimate," he admitted reluctantly, "but suggests we could contest the will based on undue influence." "You're welcome to try," I replied calmly. "Mr. Wortham has extensive documentation of Grandpa's competence and intentions, including video recording of his will signing. A court battle would be expensive, public, and unlikely to succeed. It would also extend well beyond the 30-day timeframe I'm offering for an amicable resolution." Richard and my mother exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. After a moment, Richard nodded slightly. "We'll be moving to my condo temporarily while we evaluate our options," he announced with forced dignity. "I assumed 2 weeks would be acceptable for us to arrange the move." 2 weeks is fine," I agreed. "I'll have the locks changed the day after you vacate." "Changed?" my mother repeated incredulously. "You're changing the locks on your own, mother." "Yes," I replied simply. "This house needs to become a sanctuary again, not a battleground. That starts with establishing clear boundaries." Amber, who had been uncharacteristically silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stood up. "What about my room? I just finished decorating it." "The room belongs to the house, and the house belongs to Helena," Richard told her with unexpected firmness. "Pack what you brought with you. We're leaving." I found it telling that Richard accepted the situation more readily than my mother. As a businessman, he recognized when a position was untenable and cut his losses accordingly. My mother, however, remained trapped in patterns of entitlement and emotional manipulation that had worked throughout my childhood. "I don't understand how you can do this to your own mother," she persisted, tears flowing freely now. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Richard just said you'd be going to his condo," I reminded her. "You made your choice about which relationship to prioritize when you threw away my belongings to make space for Amber. I'm simply acknowledging that choice and responding accordingly." Richard had already begun directing Amber to start packing her things, his practical nature taking over, now that he understood the legal reality. As they headed upstairs, I turned to my mother one last time. I'll be here tomorrow morning to begin assessing what repairs and changes the house needs. You're welcome to contact me through email regarding the timeline for removing your possessions, but I'd prefer communication in writing from this point forward. As I turned to leave with my friends, my mother called after me. If you go through with this, there's no coming back from it, Helena. You're destroying our family. I paused at the door, looking back at the woman who had given me life, but little else. Our family was destroyed the moment you decided I was less important than impressing your new husband. I'm just acknowledging what already happened. With those words, I walked out, my friends following quietly behind me. As the door closed, I heard my mother begin to sob dramatically, but for the first time in my life, I felt no responsibility to comfort her. The weight that lifted from my shoulders in that moment was so profound that I stopped on the front walkway, taking a deep breath of air that suddenly seemed fresher, cleaner than before. You did it, Gillian said softly, squeezing my hand. That was incredibly brave. Not brave, I corrected her as we walked to the car. Necessary. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I felt his presence not as an absence, but as a continuing influence. He had given me not just material security, but the courage to establish the boundaries he had always tried to teach me I deserved. In honouring that final gift, I was honouring him in the most meaningful way possible. The aftermath of my confrontation with my mother Richard and Amber unfolded in ways both expected and surprising. True to his word, Richard orchestrated their move within the 2-week time frame, approaching the situation with the same efficiency he applied to business matters. Professional movers arrived to pack and transport their belongings, while Richard handled the logistics with minimal direct interaction with me. My mother, however, alternated between tearful pleas and cold fury. The day after our confrontation, she called 12 times, leaving voicemails that ranged from, "How could you do this to your own mother?" to, "You'll regret this when you have no family left." When I maintained my boundary of communication by email only, she began reaching out to extended family members, crafting a narrative that painted me as an ungrateful daughter who had cruelly evicted her grieving mother. "Your cousin Melissa called me," Aunt Diane reported during one of our weekly lunches. "Apparently Susan told her you changed the locks while she was at work and threw her clothes on the lawn." I sighed, unsurprised by the fabrication. "I haven't even changed the locks yet. They're still moving out." "I set Melissa straight," Aunt Diane assured me, "and I'll continue to do so with anyone else who gets Susan's version of events. The truth has a way of emerging eventually. Not all family reactions were negative. To my surprise, my mother's sister Carol reached out with unexpected support. "I've watched Susan change since she married Richard," she told me during a coffee meeting. "The sister I knew would never have thrown away your things, especially mementos of your father. I don't know who she's become, but I understand why you needed to establish boundaries." The most unexpected support came in the form of a text message from Amber 2 days before their move was complete. "Sorry about your stuff. I told Mum we should at least ask you first, but she and Dad said it would be easier to ask forgiveness than permission. That was messed up." This glimpse of empathy from an unlikely source reminded me that people are always more complex than the roles we assign them in our personal narratives. While Amber had initially seemed merely spoiled and entitled, perhaps she too was navigating challenging family dynamics with the limited tools available to a 16-year-old. As promised, the day after they vacated, I had the locks changed and a security system installed. Walking through the empty house afterward was an emotional experience. Every room held memories of my childhood, of Grandpa visiting, of the family we had once been. The house itself was in worse condition than I had realized while living there. Richard and Amber's occupancy had accelerated the wear, with stained carpets, marked walls, and several minor damages that would need repair. In my old bedroom, now stripped of Amber's brief decorating efforts, I found a surprising gift. My mother had left the single photograph she had saved from the purge. It was a picture of the 3 of us, Mum, Dad and me as a toddler, taken at a beach vacation before his death. Whether this was a peace offering or a manipulation tactic was unclear, but I placed the photo carefully in my bag, acknowledging its significance regardless of intent. Over the following weeks, as I began the process of reclaiming and renovating the house, unexpected complications arose. Richard attempted to negotiate through his lawyer for a more equitable arrangement, suggesting that since my mother had maintained the property for years, She should be entitled to some compensation for those investments. My attorney quickly dismissed these claims, pointing out that property taxes and basic maintenance costs were substantially less than market rent would have been for 2 decades. My mother's approach was more direct and emotionally charged. She began showing up unannounced, once attempting to use her old key before discovering the locks had been changed, another time bringing boxes of my childhood artwork and school reports she claimed to have found in storage. "I saved more than you realized," she insisted through the door as I refused entry. "I've always kept your special things." The security camera captured her leaving these boxes on the porch after 30 minutes of knocking without response. When I later examined the contents, I discovered most items were indeed from my childhood, but had clearly been stored in the attic for years, rather than recently saved from the purge. The gesture felt hollow, an attempt to rewrite history, rather than acknowledge the actual betrayal. Neighbours having witnessed some of these visits began reaching out with their own perspectives. Mrs. Hathaway from next door brought over a homemade casserole one evening. "I saw what happened that day after the funeral," she confessed as I invited her in for tea. "Those garbage bags in the rain, you kneeling beside them. I should have come out to help, but by the time I realized what was happening, you had already left. Your grandfather was a good man who adored you. He would approve of how you're handling this difficult situation." This validation, from someone who had known our family dynamics for years, was unexpectedly healing. So was the discovery I made while sorting through items in the attic, a large trunk with Grandpa's handwriting on a label. "Helena's history. Keep safe." Inside were duplicate copies of many family photos, including several of my father. I had thought lost forever, carefully preserved school projects, birthday cards I had made for him, and a journal he had apparently kept about my childhood accomplishments and milestones. This treasure trove suggested Grandpa had anticipated the possibility of my mother's actions long before I could have imagined them, creating this backup of my history as another form of protection. After a month of renovation work and emotional processing, I reached a decision about the house. Rather than selling it immediately, as many had expected, I would reclaim it as my home, transforming it into the sanctuary Grandpa had always intended it to be. I converted his former study into a memorial space with his books and teaching awards. The garden became a living tribute to his love of nature, and my bedroom returned to its former purpose, though now decorated to reflect my adult tastes rather than teenage preferences. 4 months after the confrontation, when the most essential renovations were complete, I received another unexpected message from Amber. "Can I come see the house? Mum doesn't know I'm asking." After careful consideration, I agreed to a brief visit. When she arrived, her typically confident demeanour was subdued. "I've been seeing a therapist since everything happened," she explained, as I showed her the changes to the property. "She's helping me understand how messed up some of our family patterns are. Dad tries to solve everything with money, and your mum just goes along with whatever he wants. I started standing up to them about some things, and it's been pretty intense." This glimpse into their household dynamic confirmed what I had suspected. My mother had simply transferred her pattern of emotional dependence from my father to Richard, continuing to prioritize a romantic relationship over her role as a parent. "The house looks amazing," Amber commented as our tour concluded. "It feels completely different now, peaceful." "That's what a home should feel like," I told her. "A sanctuary, not a battleground." Her visit ended with an awkward but seemingly genuine hug and a request. "Can I come back sometimes? I feel like I could learn a lot from you about standing up for yourself." This unexpected connection with my stepsister represented the beginning of something I hadn't anticipated: the creation of a chosen family based on mutual respect rather than mere biological connection or legal arrangement. It was yet another dimension of Grandpa's legacy, the understanding that family is defined by how we treat each other, not just shared DNA or living arrangements. My mother made one final attempt at reconciliation 6 months after moving out. She arrived with my father's wedding ring, which I had believed lost in the purge. "I found this in my jewelry box," she said when I cautiously opened the door. "I must have put it there for safekeeping years ago and forgotten. I know how much it means to you." The ring was indeed meaningful, but her framing of its discovery as accidental rather than an acknowledgement of deliberate withholding demonstrated that she still couldn't fully own her actions or their impact. "Thank you for returning it," I said, accepting the ring, but not the implied narrative of reconciliation without accountability. "Helena, it's been 6 months, she pressed. "How long are you going to punish me? I'm still your mother."
Get this and see, and I didn't.
I considered her question seriously before responding. I'm not punishing you, Mom. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference. When you're ready to truly acknowledge what happened and work on rebuilding trust, we can discuss what kind of relationship might be possible going forward. She left without further argument, and our contact since has been limited to occasional text messages and brief interactions at family gatherings. It's not the mother-daughter relationship portrayed in greeting cards or family sitcoms, but it's honest and maintains the boundaries necessary for my well-being. 6 months has now become 2 years since that rainy day when I returned from Grandpa's funeral to find my belongings discarded. The house that was once the site of such painful betrayal has been completely transformed into a true sanctuary. The renovations I began as practical necessity evolved into a therapeutic process of reclaiming space and creating a home that reflects who I've become. Grandpa's presence remains strong throughout the property. I've maintained his garden, expanded it, actually growing the vegetables he taught me to tend and sharing the harvest with neighbours just as he always did. His collection of first edition science books occupies a special bookcase in the living room. The memorial space I created in what was once his study has become my favourite place for morning coffee and reflection. Professionally, I've continued to grow as well. The confidence that emerged from standing up for myself extended to my work life, giving me courage to apply for the paediatric nursing specialist position I had previously considered beyond my reach. 6 months into this new role, my supervisor nominated me for a Regional Excellence in Nursing Award, citing my unique combination of technical skill and emotional intelligence with patients and families. You have a gift for creating safety in crisis situations, she noted during my performance review. Patients and their families trust you implicitly. This observation resonated deeply, as creating safety and establishing appropriate boundaries are skills I had to develop for my own survival. That these same abilities now benefit others feels like transforming pain into purpose, another lesson Grandpa would have appreciated. Personal relationships have evolved significantly as well. My friendship circle expanded beyond hospital colleagues to include a woodworking group I joined while learning to restore some of Grandpa's antique furniture. Through this group, I met Daniel, a high school history teacher, whose patience and genuine interest in understanding others reminded me of Grandpa's approach to relationships. Our connection developed slowly, built on mutual respect and clear communication. When I finally shared the full story of my mother's betrayal and Grandpa's protective inheritance, Daniel's response confirmed what I already sensed about his character. What strikes me most, he said after listening without interruption, is not just your grandfather's foresight, but your courage in establishing boundaries, when it would have been easier to continue the pattern of accommodation. My relationship with my mother remains complex and limited. After multiple attempts at reconciliation without genuine accountability, I've accepted that she may never fully understand or acknowledge the impact of her actions. We maintain contact through occasional family gatherings and brief text exchanges, but without the forced intimacy that once masked fundamental disconnection. Richard eventually purchased a new home for them in a neighbouring community, a property he proudly describes as much more suitable than our family house ever was. My mother appears to have fully embraced her identity as his wife, posting carefully curated social media images of their luxurious lifestyle, while rarely mentioning her life before him or her role as a mother. Surprisingly, my relationship with Amber has evolved in unexpected ways. After that initial visit to see the renovated house, she began reaching out regularly, initially with questions about college applications as she prepared for her senior year, then increasingly about navigating family dynamics as she developed her own identity separate from her father's wealth and influence. "You're the only person who sees them clearly and still functions," she told me during one of our coffee meetings. "Everyone else either buys into their version of reality or cuts them off completely. I need to figure out how to be my own person without completely destroying my relationship with Dad." This mentor relationship with my stepsister represents perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire painful episode. The betrayal that was meant to prioritize her comfort at my expense ultimately created a connection based on genuine understanding rather than forced familial obligation. As for the inheritance itself, I've managed it with the same careful consideration Grandpa would have expected. The house has become my permanent home, its mortgage-free status allowing me financial freedom to help others. I established a small scholarship at the high school where Grandpa taught providing funds for students pursuing healthcare careers. A portion of the investment portfolio has been designated for community garden initiatives, extending his legacy of growing both plants and people. The most profound change, however, has been internal. The woman who once made excuses for mistreatment and prioritized others' comfort over her own well-being has been replaced by someone who understands that boundaries are not selfish but necessary, that standing up for yourself isn't cruel but essential, and that family should be defined by actions rather than mere biology. Grandpa's final gift wasn't just financial security or property ownership. It was permission to create a life based on authentic values rather than obligatory relationships. It was validation that my worth existed independent of my mother's ability to recognize it. It was the understanding that sometimes the most loving action is establishing limits rather than enabling harmful patterns. On the wall of what is now my home office hangs a simple framed quote that summarizes the most important lesson from this journey: family should be a sanctuary, not a battleground. These words, which Grandpa repeated throughout my childhood, have become both my comfort and my compass. Creating that sanctuary sometimes requires difficult decisions, painful confrontations, and the courage to allow natural consequences to unfold. But the peace that emerges from those challenges is worth every moment of discomfort. True family, whether connected by blood or by choice, nurtures rather than diminishes, supports rather than undermines, and recognizes worth rather than assigns convenience value. As I look around the home that has witnessed both my deepest pain and most profound growth, I am filled with gratitude for Grandpa's foresight in providing not just shelter, but the opportunity to discover my own strength. In honoring his legacy by creating a life of integrity and boundary-based relationships, I've discovered that the greatest inheritance wasn't the property itself, but the self-respect it empowered me to claim. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between maintaining a relationship and protecting your own well-being? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to hear more reflections on family dynamics, boundaries, and the sometimes challenging journey toward authentic self-worth. Thank you for bearing witness to my story, and remember that you deserve to create sanctuary in your own life, whatever form that might take.